The Australian tank meme. Let's see this thing. This is going to be awesome. Amazing.
This video is sponsored by World of Tanks, a free-to-play online multiplayer tank game.
Whoa! World of Tanks!
Take into battle and live out your historical fantasies that undeniably confirm that your favorite tank, it was actually the best one. Look, right there, see that? Notice which one's not on fire? I rest my case. They've got a whole 40 diverse maps allowing you to live out any tank.
Okay, let's skip the ad. I don't want to see an ad right now. Enter code combat. Okay, I believe it.
And a free camo. That's invite code combat. Thank you, World of Tanks.
Okay. Operation Downfall, Japan, 1946. What the heck is this? Oh wow, World of War Tanks! Is this the new Assassin's Creed Shadows? Is that Yasuke? Just skip.
So I'll be real with you, this was supposed to be the Minor Allies tank video, going over tanks of a few notable ones, basically the other side of that Minor Axis tank video from
That's amazing.
4 years ago.
4 years?
Searching though, I realized I had forgotten the golden rule of World War II, that being that the Allies were stacked, to the point that multiple minor nations managed full domestic tank production. One of them was Australia, a nation of just 7 million people and very little heavy industry that, despite the odds, went from design to serial production of a tank.
Well, here in Brazil, we never did that. We just stole a bunch of American stuff. Yeah, I need to post that Stuart photo. He's amazing. Such a cool tank.
The AC-1 Sentinel in the span of around 2 years. While the tank is a testament to the ingenuity and determination of the small country, it also signifies one of the lowest points in Allied cooperation during the war. Australian troops didn't operate tanks in the First World War, but they did fight alongside British ones, and the experience was enough to give the peacetime militia-based Australian army an interest in mechanization during the interwar era that they did their best to pursue. That was an uphill battle though, as tanks are expensive and they were Australia. And then the Depression happened.
Yeah, Australia doesn't have the strongest economy back then.
However, some progress was made, with the purchase of 4 Vickers Medium Mark II tanks in 1927 for initial training, and a further 10 Vickers Mark VI light tanks in 1937. It was supposed to be 24 Mark VIs, but please consult the graphic. The plan
Well, they just needed to be like the New Zealand's Bob Sample, guys. Where's your Bob Sample? The greatest tank ever. Without Bob Sample, Japan would invade New Zealand.
was still to expand in the future, and the hope was the world events of the late 30s would provide motivation for funding, ideally before something bad happened.
The partition of Poland. Yeah?
In response to the German invasion of Poland, Britain declared war on Germany September 3rd, 1939. And because of their unique legal status, Australia did as well by default. Even though the Tripartite Pact was defensive, its signatories have been less than predictable the past few years. An open war with Germany meant an increased risk of war with Japan for Australia, and the strength of Japanese tank forces was investigated as a result. What they found was a much stronger force than they had anticipated, especially compared to their tank force that kind of existed. This rather alarming news prompted Chief of the General Staff...
Yeah, who would have thought that a nation with just like 30 tanks could go against Japan, who had multiple light tanks, and kind of got the tank design, but in the later years before World War II, they kind of just forgot how to build good tanks.
General Ernest Squires to officially request the Master.
That's not to say I don't love the Hago. I love the Hago in Enlisted, but yeah, there's a reason why the Sherman and the Stuart won.
General of Ordnance to begin the process of designing a cruiser tank, eventually to be produced in Australia, which is a bit of a leap, not just for the Australian tank force, who, I want to stress this, possessed only 14 imported tanks so far.
14?
But also for Australian industry that had never designed or built a tank before. The specifications were broad. They wanted a light cruiser with a 2-pounder gun capable of 30 miles an hour and enough armor to withstand Japanese 13mm anti-tank rounds. That's it. The Master General of Ordnance, already coordinating pressing munitions projects because a war just started, saw this clearly panicked and not very well thought out request for what it was and just never replied to it. The unstated assumption for Australia was that if they needed tanks or other materials
they would get from the US and the UK
produce, the British would just provide it or attach their troops to British units equipped with them. So Australian tank formations and the vehicles themselves really remained a low priority until...
Oh yeah, because the British lost so much equipment at Dunkirk that they probably were going to be pretty in panic. They were going to be in panic.
704 tanks in service
704?
with the British Expeditionary Force in 1940. Only 13 were able to be evacuated from France with the troops in June, leaving just 353 armored vehicles total to fend off a German invasion of the British Isles that, at the time, looked imminent. For Australia, this meant British equipment supply could no longer be assumed, even in an emergency for the foreseeable future. The Army's response was ambitious, drafting a proposal to the War Cabinet for a mechanized corps, including a tank division with vehicles produced in Australia. The whole program was made conditional on British approval and specialists being sent over for technical advice. The job of designing and coordinating production on what would become the Sentinel was assigned to the Department of Munitions. And as difficult as a first-time project like this would be for any nation, Australia's lack of heavy industry made their tank program even more difficult.
It's kind of just like Italy, because Italy also didn't have a strong economy and strong industrial capabilities. But looking at the World of Tanks model that is on screen, it doesn't look like a Italian tank, that they were small and frail and kind of ass. But I love them. The LT, it's the LT. The LT, the perfect getaway car. I would buy one just to have a tank, actually. Oh, the FT, the French FT. I think it is a great tank, and it's two-man tank. I could ride it with my brother and wreak chaos.
Not only do they have to design a tank,
so subscribe for one day. I will buy a tank and I will conquer something, maybe a bunch of boxes.
That's reliable and meets specifications, they have to make sure all the components could either be imported reliably or manufactured at home by production lines that they had to build more or less from scratch. Also, the Army needed this thing in the field like yesterday, so hurry up please. Because of all that, it was decided to set up production as the design was being worked on. Normally this sort of method is avoided because it's too inefficient. You're basically guaranteed to have a scenario where designs aren't finished in time, and until they are, your factory full of workers are just standing around instead of aiding the war effort. But given the situation, it was the plan they kind of had to go with. The result was a lot of industrial troubleshooting between designers, overseas suppliers, and domestic manufacturers on what components could be made.
Wait. Part needed? Can we get it from the US, Canada? Yes. Success? No. Try different company? Yes. No. Success? No. Must be made in Italy? Design it? Can we simplify? Yes. Can we make it as design? Yes. Success? No. Can we? No. Yeah. No. I don't know. So, parts needed. Must be made in Australia. Design it. Can we make as design? No. Can we simplify? No. I don't know, bro. Further, Solid just try Wallace and Gromit shit. Oh no! The Wallace and Gromit shit. We are going to fire a silver carrot.
Or imported, and how that paralyzed the design process and, by extension, the whole project. Take the engine, for example. The goal was to have engines built in Australia, but since that would take time, they opted to import the first batch from the Americans while
engine
production at home. The problem was, The US didn't have any tank engines to spare yet in 1940. Next, they looked at modified Pratt & Whitney aircraft engines that were already in production in Australia. This was approved pending the expansion of the production line, as aircraft production was given priority and needed to remain unaffected. The timeline for that, though, was 12 months or longer, so that wouldn't work either. After the better part of 2 years of looking for something that would work, the solution they finally came up with was to use 3 Cadillac V8 car engines that, when mounted together, produced enough power to meet the tank's speed requirements. And they could
that's the type of stuff I love saying. Oh, the 18 the engine is not we can't have this engine, so we're just going to glue a bunch of engines together. Oh, the engine doesn't fit, just put in a box back at the back of the train. That's British designing at its finest, and the Australians got that from the British.
The engine, though, was far from the only part that this happened with. An issue worked out entirely in Australia was the armor. Australia didn't have facilities that could produce armor plate at the size and scale needed for a welded or riveted hull, so they had to use castings instead. The problem was, the alloy used to make cast armor required nickel, and at the time, they didn't have any. Casting was their only option, though, so foundries developed a different alloy to get around the issue, along with a method to cast the entire hull in a single piece, which hadn't been done before and reduced the tank's assembly time. Side note, while I'm talking about castings, one of the more famous parts of the Sentinel's design is the armored housing for the Vickers gun in the hull that looks a bit... Penis!
That's totally a bit, but that's awesome! I can probably see why nobody did that ever again, because this is probably going to be a pain in the ass to replace, but that's awesome that you can just cast an entire body of a tank.
Wasn't intentional. It's just the most efficient shape to use when casting an armored housing around a gun's water jacket. Unintentional banger, though. 10 out of 10. Well,
yes, let me see the dick.
No doubt the issues with the tank were being worked out, often in very clever ways, literally advancing metallurgy out of their determination to make this thing work. Progress was slow. In February 1941, the initial Progress was slow. In February 1941, the initial projections of delivering 5 tanks per week starting in November 1941 were walked back to May 1942, and then even further back to June. This was especially troubling due to fears that war with Japan was on the horizon, and a stopgap order of 200 American M3 light tanks was approved. In July of 41, a second tank design, the AC-2, was proposed and approved. This is essentially just an AC-1 with all the components proving especially difficult to set up production for, such as the gearbox, substituted with inferior but readily available parts so they could get tanks to the troops faster. This was recognized for the dodgy idea it was by the Army, who rejected it, but not in time to prevent the tank from causing a minor international incident. While simplified, the AC-2 still required parts imported from the US, and when the US Lend-Lease Authority saw the Australians asking for new parts for a second tank, almost identical to the one that they had already heavily invested in, the reaction was bad enough that the Australian director for AFV production had to travel to the US to smooth things over. The Lend-Lease Board flat out refused to support the AC-2, but were convinced to continue supporting the AC-1.
Oh, thank God.
Support, it was hoped the tanks would soon begin rolling out before any unforeseen...
Oh no, the Japanese, Japan. Japan starts war.
Strike South kicked the tank program into overdrive, at least as much as was physically possible, and the first pilot model was tested in January 1942. The results weren't great and prompted an official inquiry on the project. On the upside, the US is in the war now, and American M3 light and medium tanks began flowing into Australia by the hundreds. The downside of the upside, the Army took the position that they were obsolete. This view was held only for the European theater, but it was enough of a concern for Prime Minister Curtin to approve the continuation of the program following the inquiry. This raised an awkward question, though. If the American tanks are outdated, wouldn't the AC-1 armed with a 2-pounder be as well? The only gun produced in Australia able to replace the 2-pounder was the 25-pounder field gun, and on May 27, 1942, A full month before conducting a successful gunnery trial to even test the idea, plans for a new model dubbed the AC-3 were drawn up.
Oh my god. This is such a mess. Oh, we didn't finish our first tank, so we are going to build a second tank. And when the second tank and the first tank are not finished, we are going to build a third tank with a new gun. God damn, that's awful, awful, awful.
And in order for 400 of them, on top of the outstanding AC-1 orders, was placed.
And the
This
AC-2
wild
was...
sequence of events pushed Minister for the Army Percy Spender to question why they were doing all of this. In his eyes, the AC program remained a significant investment for the country. The delivery dates have been pushed back again to September of 1942, and now a second model had been created when the first one hadn't even gone into production yet. What are we doing here, guys? What is...
Yeah, especially when you have the U.S. sending tanks and that stuff. Why don't you just copy what the U.S. did and use parts from their tanks to build your tank?
The Army, though, continued to back the program and again cited that the Lend-Lease tanks were out of date. In July, it was decided that the 17-pounder would replace the 25-pounder in the AC-3 as production scaled down for the latter as Army requirements were almost fully met. They were a bit more responsible this time, though, and tested the idea first. However, they didn't have any 17-pounders yet, so to simulate the recoil, they mounted two 25-pounders and one turret. If you've ever seen this picture before and wondered if it was real, it was, but it's to test recoil and not intended for combat.
Ah, come on! Imagine a two-turret tank! That's such a Warhammer design!
The AC-2 fiasco, Australia deciding to commit to the production of 3 tank models in the span of 2 months, with none past the trial phase, drew the attention of the U.S. Lend-Lease administration, who sent a strongly worded letter to the Australian...
In the 23 July 1942 letter from Charles W. U.S. Lieutenant Mission to Australia listing U.S. objections, paraphrase. This is getting in the way of railroad upkeep. This is getting in the way of other production. This is getting in the way of U.S. provided tank maintenance. You sure you got those castings worked out? If not, how long are you able to transport these things by rail? The project weight is pretty high. Got the engines worked out? We can give you M3s all day long. Are you sure this isn't a waste of time? A production model hasn't been tested. You sure it's a superior design and worth all this effort? Yes. Just
War Cabinet asking them what the hell they were doing. The Australian response, while hopeful, did not...
Aussie reply. Field trials begin in a week. Tests of components have been satisfactory so far. They have been positive enough. Abandoning this project at this stage would be stupid. Just import a bunch of blob samples from New Zealand. They are your neighbors. Let's make it the Bob sample.
Inspire a lot of confidence in the Americans, who in early October made a soft request for the AC program to be canceled via 2 messages and some reading between the lines. The first stated that continued material support for the program was under review, and the second, received a few days later, informed them that for the time being, no more M3 medium tanks would be allocated to Australia. But that could change depending on what the future holds. Who knows? When that still didn't work, they sent a formal request to end the program. It read, "The U.S. Department of Ordnance has recommended that the tank manufacturing program in Australia be discontinued, and that Australia should fall into line with Great Britain and Canada in using tanks of a standard American design," and closed by offering technical assistance to Australia if they decided to build M4 medium tanks instead. Negotiations over the details
just copy what the Americans did, like every single person ever.
Between the Lend-Lease admin in Australia into 1943. While Australia wasn't principally against ending Sentinel production and standardizing on American tanks, the Lend-Lease administration was never able to fully commit to sending Sherman tanks to Australia, which was a hard requirement for them to do so. Eventually, the Lend-Lease administration had enough and sent a representative, Colonel G.A. Green, to evaluate the Sentinel program and advise on its continued support from the U.S. The result was the Australian Tank Production Report, dated May 17, 1944.
He probably loved the project.
It does not paint a very positive picture.
What do you mean?
Green had some high praise for parts of the program itself, noting excellent personnel, considerable ingenuity displayed in the design, and excellent infrastructure created for maintenance. To summarize his feelings in a quote, considering that prior to this war, Australia did not possess any AFV industry, and taking into account limitations under which this work has been carried out, progress is credible. As far as the tank itself goes, he complimented their successfully mounting the 17-pounder, the low profile, their furthering of cast armor technology, the gun mounting maximizing crew space, and says overall, if the mechanical defects are fixed, the Sentinel would be one of the most reliable vehicles in Allied inventory. As for the bad, well, the gun was too small, the engine overheats, the transfer case is too complicated, the air cleaners don't work, the turret traverse mechanism doesn't work, the rubber on the bogey wheels falls off, the turret ring is too small, the front and the belly plates are too thin, and a whole bunch of technical issues I don't have the automotive knowledge to explain.
So you're telling me if we just literally fix every single mechanical problem, it's going to be the greatest tank ever? Well, Germany built stuff with less. Hey guys, the mouse tank.
Long list of issues. His real criticism, though, is of the program itself, writing that although it's a great achievement for the country, in a practical sense, it's only been a drain on the war effort in raw materials and manpower, making a specific point about U.S. supplied machine tools that would be much better used back in the U.S. making U.S. tanks. For the huge investment that the program represented, at the time of writing, the only tank produced, the AC-1, was non-standard to all other tanks in Australian service, still in testing, and had already been deemed obsolete. The AC-3 is just a worse AC-4, the designation for the 17-pounder tank, and completely redundant, and the AC-4, while modern, is so early in development, it will likely be outdated by the time it gets into production. Furthermore, Green notes that the Australian Army concluded in a report that 304 AC-3 and 4 tanks, or 304 American mediums, would be satisfactory to meet their tactical needs, and they currently possess 757 U.S. medium tanks, more than double their requirement.
So let me get this straight. We have the tanks that we need to defend our country, but we are going to build more tanks. Again, Germany built tanks with less.
While these were M3s and outdated, Green notes that this is a shipping issue and should be worked out soon. But even if it's not, that still doesn't justify the continued waste of manpower and material. Also, the M3s were doing very well in the Pacific and would continue to do so for years. The Australians needed to get over this whole Europe thing. The body most invested in the Sentinel's success, aside from the design team, was the Army, who had kept a keen interest in Green's investigation and requested an advance copy of the report be delivered to General Blamey, commander of Australian military forces, as...
Look at the stash! Look at the stash of that man! God damn!
Soon as it was finished before publication. Green's list of problems with the tank was so long that Blamey didn't really have any other choice other than to reject the tank and endorse the report, which he did at a meeting a full 10 days before it was officially published.
God
the
damn.
withdrawal of Army support essentially killed the AC program, although it wasn't officially canceled until August 26th, once assurances that Sherman tanks would be sent to Australia were made, sticking to that demand to the very bitter end. Ironically, only 2 Shermans were ever sent to Australia because during Army tank trials, they liked the Churchill better and adopted it instead. Despite the program's cancellation, the Sentinel was a huge technical achievement for Australia with the limitations they had to work with. This is a national achievement, and I hope it's seen that way over there. That said, the Americans had the correct opinion, and they were a lot better at seeing the bigger picture. In fact, I don't think the US went far enough. By 1943 at the latest, they should have barged into the UK Mechanization Board and said, hey, the Cruiser Mark 27 or whatever is canceled, and we left 5,000 M4A1s outside. Get out there and be somebody. Unfortunately for the global Allied war effort broadly, and Cone of Arc specifically, the British still maintained the illusion of a major power at the time, thank God that's over, and the Western Allies had to win the war below potential peak efficiency. A few Sentinels are still around today. The ideal one to go see, in my opinion, is at the RAAC Museum Because of the Sentinel, they also have one of each of the pre-war Vickers tanks and the 2 Shermans sent over for the tank trials.
Oh my god, that's amazing!
US, but those traitors at Wargaming gave it back to the Australians. Oh, go play their game, Code Combat. World of Tanks. They're actually a huge help with the footage for this video. Believe it or not, there's not a lot of Sentinel footage around, and being able to report it in the game was extremely helpful.
No, I don't agree with you. I believe that we need to make tanks just like the Germans did.